My name is George Yu. I'm a retired professor of political science at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, where it's even colder than it is here in the winter. I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank the university for organizing this meeting. I want to thank Dan for inviting me. It's very nice to be here. You were saying how I came to this topic. It was not exactly accidental, but it was something that was rather a little bit unexpected. I had finished my PhD and I had finished revising my thesis, which was on the Chinese 1911 revolution and the role that the Kuomintang, or the Chinese Nationalist Party, had in this 1911 revolution, which overthrew the Manchu dynasty and established the Republic of China. In the academic context, when you go in and see your chair, he always puts aside what you have published and asks you, what is your new project? At that time, I wasn't quite certain, but I was certain of one thing. I wanted to continue doing research and studying China, but I wanted to do a subject that I could observe China's behavior firsthand and to experience what the Chinese, both the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China on Taiwan were up to. In the early 1960s, something that caught my eye was Taiwan had already established itself in Taiwan and was very active on the African continent and had received the support of the new African state to maintain its role on the global front. But then in the 1960s, the People's Republic of China decided it had to take a more active global role and began to be active in China. And I found this competition or this expansion of role on the part of the People's Republic of China very interesting. And so I began to take up that subject matter and I continued with it. I think that's all I should say here.
We'll certainly hear more about that. Thank you. Zainab.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you, Dan, for inviting me and for convening this important seminar or event, in a sense. I think it's important to have these fora to engage with something that is so dynamic and so interesting in a number of ways. So a brief introduction. I am completing my doctorate in international development at the University of Oxford. I'm a political economist, so I'm doing a political economy analysis of economic reform in resource-rich countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but with a specific focus on Nigeria. And for me, in the course of my research, the China-Africa dimension kept coming up. And initially I took an approach of sort of like waving it aside or controlling for it here and there. And then eventually I just realized that it was best to engage with it because, as I mentioned, it's a very dynamic phenomenon in a number of ways. You can't really have a holistic view of ongoing reform, in a sense, in many African countries without really engaging with the dimension of Chinese engagement, not just in the extractive industries, but also in a lot of other emerging sectors and services industries. So one of the other things I do is that I co-run the Oxford University China-Africa Network. And there we are a hub, in a sense, for sort of aggregating research on this emerging phenomenon. So research in the academia, but we also try to sort of build bridges with policymakers, practitioners, and even the media. We do a number of things, including a flagship annual conference over the summer. We have a blog where we try to distill a lot of the key things going on in that space, but for a sort of informed but non-specialist audience. We do quite a number of things, and all of this is available on our website. So just to sort of recap, I'm a political economist, but then I'm now sort of engaged with this phenomenon. So this is it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Chris.
Should I take the mic? Yeah.
Okay.
Great. I can start by, again, echoing what my colleagues had said, to thank the university and you personally for inviting me to this event and to be on a panel with both of my colleagues here. It's really a pleasure. I came to this topic in several ways. To be autobiographical and to the extreme, as a kid, I was raised in Africa and Asia, so it seemed to me something that made sense. It wasn't a question, an oddity. It was the way the world, I looked at the world. And then, as an undergraduate, I took that to write my undergraduate thesis on the role of the Indian political community in South Africa, Gandhi essentially, and after that was being educated in the United States. This was the 80s was the era of the Pacific century. This was a lot of work and attention to that. When I moved to South Africa in 1990 to take up a post at the University of the Witwatersrand, I looked around the programs in the university, and I couldn't find that Pacific century about which I was hearing so much about. And on that basis, began to look into and set up a program in the early 90s to study the politics of Asia, the international politics of Asia, with an emphasis on what was the burning debate within South Africa at that time. They called it the Two China debate. So it was about Republic of China and People's Republic of China, and all of that began a process that enabled someone like myself and my colleagues in South Africa to see the relationship unfold, if you like, from the ground up. So it was a very interesting time to be part of that, and it had its momentum. It's a train that I got on, and I can't. It was very slow at the beginning. It's going so fast now. I'm afraid to jump off. So.
Thank you. And I think that's very true, not just in academic terms, but also policy terms, where not everyone chooses to engage this subject. Sometimes it's forced upon individuals and agencies as well for very pressing policy reasons. Thank you very much. I'd like to look back now and historicize something that's very topical today, which is the idea of a China model in development, globally, but also in Africa, and ask George, first of all, about China's development role in Tanzania in the 1960s, because you wrote in 1970 that the primary attraction for the Tanzanian elite about the China model lay in its perceived technical competency and ability to move rapidly towards modernity. So could you say a bit more about what that meant then for Tanzania?
Certainly. But if I could just use a few minutes to talk about the context in which the Chinese arrived in Africa, because this had a lot to do with their eventual close relationship with Tanzania and the appeal that the Chinese had to the Tanzanian. The contextual aspect is very, very important. In the 1960s and even the 1970s, we are at the height of the Cold War, a period. And when the People's Republic of China arrived or advanced on to Africa, they found themselves in three conflict modes. It was a very conflictual period for the People's Republic of China, namely the whys of their arrival in China. There are several things, and I would just like to briefly mention three. First is that in the 1960s, China was in search of its own identity, a legitimacy, and a sovereignty. And as I said earlier, the Republic of China, namely the government of Taiwan, had arrived there earlier in the 50s and had obtained a recognition that it was a China, which of course was a direct challenge to the People's Republic of China, which was searching for its own identity, a legitimacy, and a sovereignty. So one of the battles that the People's Republic of China found itself engaged in Africa was the battle with Taiwan on who was to be China, or who was to be legitimately hold the title of China. And that's why even to this day, sometimes when there are agreements between the People's Republic and an African state, sometimes in the agreement there's always the clause or the phase that such and such African country recognizes China as the sole China, as the legitimate China. Of course, eventually in 1961, China regards that date as very important, because that was when China was recognized by the UN and replaced the Republic of China in Taiwan. So it gained its legitimacy symbolically and real in that sense. Now, the second conflict front that the Chinese also found itself in Africa was to try to free itself from the political and military isolation that was imposed upon it by the United States. At that time, in the early 60s, when China was trying to gain a legitimacy and recognition to battle the United States and using Africa as a battleground was very important, because China thought it could easily make a presence and win some of the support of the newly African states. So that was a second conflict front. And then the third that I just want to mention briefly was the Sino-Soviet dispute that happened in the 60s and the 70s between the then Soviet Union and China as to who was the true communist. And some of these specific issues, some of you may recall, is that China accused the then Soviet Union of not being a real revolutionary state, for example, because it did not support wars of liberation as much as the Chinese said they do, for fear that a little spark will turn into a major fire. So this context that the Chinese saw, shall we say, Africa as a three-level, at least, conflict zone in which they had to win different goals is important for us to understand. But within this conflictual context, the Chinese also sought to win friends and influence people to get the support it wanted and form what I call informal alliances. And one of the first, and still to my mind, one of the most successful, was China's informal alliance, quote unquote, with Tanzania. Now, to win friends and influence people and form these informal alliances, you just can't say, I am your friend. There must be a response on the part of the recipient. And China found a very willing and supportive partner in Tanzania. And let me just say, among other things, in addition to material aid that was much appreciated by the Tanzanian, and the most famous of which was the building of the Tanzania-Zambian railway, starting in the late 60s, completing it in 1975, was the perception of the Tanzanian leadership, represented by then President Nyerere, was China was the developmental model that it thought was the model that Tanzania could emulate and succeed, not exactly to be an exact duplicate of China, but some of the features. For example, in the 1960s, Tanzania, at least President Nyerere, was very impressed with the organizational and the, for example, regimentation that the Chinese had been able to achieve so as to begin to emerge as a new nation. And in President Nyerere's 3 visits, he constantly, repeated the admiration for the Chinese success. Now, some of you know, in the 60s was also the period of the great upheaval in China, namely the Cultural Revolution. And President Nyerere even said, maybe the Cultural Revolution upheaval, in which the people were, in China at least, were forced to engage in certain types of acts and regimentation, was something perhaps even Tanzania could emulate. Now, this is something in the 60s, you wouldn't think about it now, which gives you an idea how things started and how things eventually changed. But for the 60s at least, the Chinese model, the Cultural Revolution, organization, regimentation, and of course plus economic growth, was very much looked upon as a possible model for Tanzania and certain other African states.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And in keeping with this theme, I wonder if you and perhaps Chris might reflect upon the role of history today, not just in politics, but also policy, when it comes to these development themes. Do we need to know anything about the past to engage the present? We've already heard part of that answer, but would you share other thoughts on that, Chris?
I do think that, building on what George has said, that an understanding of history and the trajectories, or our interpretation of the trajectories, has influenced how viable a particular policy might be, a policy model and the like. Let's take the example in 2006 with the Beijing, a high point in the China-Africa formal relationship around the questions of a China as a development model. Up till that time, China had forsworn the Chinese leadership would tell the African counterparts, you must go your own way. You find your own route. And this remains a general principle adhered to. Yet in 2006, there were initiated 2 particular programs by China, which reflected their own understandings of their development experience and the successes in putting that together. And that was, so we have their interpretation of what constitutes success in the Chinese context, and that it could be exported to the African context. And one of them was the development, the agricultural technical demonstration centers, of which 10 and then 20 were initiated as part of the program. Here, the idea was China had made its initial foray successfully in the early 1980s to develop the rural areas as a way for creating the financial base and the ideas base for what would become that rapid Chinese development that we're all aware of. So the creation, the setting up of agricultural technical demonstration centers derives from China's interpretation of its own development success, how it understands what made development work, and these have been rolled out to varying degrees of success, but they've been rolled out across the continent. The second was the special economic zones. Again, one of those features which for China, and indeed for scholars more generally, has been crucial to the development success of China, the rapid growth. So 3 to 5 initially special economic zones were sponsored and set up by China with host African governments across the continent. It's spread out. There have been private ones as well as these public or state-funded ones. And again, the relative success is a matter of debate, and we can talk about that. But the more significant point when it comes to models and history and the like is an interpretation of what made China successful, something hugely appealing to the African leadership, the elite. This is real concrete development. This isn't a plan dreamed up on H Street in Washington, D.C. by the World Bank. This is something that has happened, and in the living memory of many of the African leaders who went there in the 1960s or 70s, could see that Africa was, that their own countries were in a better development position often than China itself, and yet they return 20 years later and they see Shanghai, they see Beijing, places that literally didn't exist. They see modernity. And in that sense, China has been able to communicate that it is modernity, a development modernity that Africa can strive to and with Chinese help achieve.
Thank you. Zainab, I wonder if you wanted to add to that, and if we're to understand the evolution of China's development role, whether you'd have anything to say from the perspective of the political economy of different African states before the current downturn, and then the impact of the current downturn on that development question as well.
Wow, that's that's a broad question. So I guess one thing to focus on is perhaps the nature of dependencies, how African states are perceived to be dependent in a sense, and sort of conceptualizing the nature of those dependencies and where, in a sense, China fits in, at least within the contemporary historical period, if I can call it that. And so we have to understand that whilst, African states, many African states have their agency, this is constrained by a number of things. And perhaps if we understand these constraints, then we would be in a better position to understand the nature of China-Africa relations and how they are evolving over time. And I mean, I would argue that, we can approach it from three perspectives or three ways, in a sense. So the first being, the changing nature of the integration of African economies into the global economy, in a sense. So in the first few post-colonial decades, the dependency was on, exporting commodities, mineral resources, agriculture produce, etc., etc. And how this, in a sense, persisted through the post-Cold War period and also the democratization period of the late 1990s to date. So the interesting thing is, whilst a lot of African economies were not affected by the global financial crisis that we saw, whereas a number of emerging economies were more affected, that is different now with the kind of turmoil going on in China right now, the economic turmoil, and how a number of countries are now affected. So my point is, we have to understand the pattern of integration of different African economies into the global economy and how that creates dependencies, the nature of dependencies. So the second point is also the economic and resource base of a particular country or particular African country in question. And you can obviously broaden this to, general factor endowments, land, resources, labor and human resources, capital, finance, infrastructure, and things like that. But one thing that I would focus on really, and this is something that has been persistent from the early post-colonial period to date, is the capital scarcity in many African economies. And in the first few decades of the post-colonial period, this was in the form of, just the lack of finance or the scarcity of investments to drive industrialization in a number of African economies. This, in a sense, sort of changed and evolved over time to the point where, even though now you have a lot of resource-rich countries, Nigeria, South Africa, Angola, Ghana, etc., the issue now is really infrastructure and the kinds of dependencies that creates as well. So the third is also the nature and history of state building and the kinds of weak institutions that has generated. And across the board, there are quite a number of problems, political problems that many African countries have gone through. And obviously, I don't want to generalize here, but across the board, whether it's military coups, civil war, or just sort of the distortion of institutions by a number of factors. But what we have in the contemporary period really is that despite democratization, as a lot of countries are embarking on macroeconomic reform, as a number of countries are trying to diversify their economies, as this agenda for structural transformation proceeds, many African economies are confronted with weak bureaucracies, weak civil service. So, in a sense, we're moving beyond conducting elections or having reform-oriented leaders to actually what these leaders can deliver, in a sense. So one example that I would like to give here is in Nigeria, for instance, there was a credible election last year, which was generally praised by the international community, elections observers, and so on and so forth, and a new president who had this a reform agenda, anti-corruption, jobs creation, and things like that. But then it soon became obvious that good intentions were just not enough, because he was confronted and is still confronted with a very weak civil service. So he recently had a budget proposal that was very problematic because a lot of the ministries had padded up their own budgets and things like that. And you have a situation where in quite a number of countries, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, you have key sections of ministries that are, sometimes they're even run by consultancies like McKinsey or by development partners, which in itself is not a bad thing, but over the long term, it creates certain kinds of dependencies as well. So generally, to conclude, my point is we have to understand these dependencies of different countries, and if we take an approach of focusing on maybe these three factors that I mentioned, then we can sort of understand where China fits in this equation. So,
thank you.
Yeah,
yes, and again, it's interesting the historical parallels in terms of the desire for self-sufficiency, economic self-sufficiency, political self-sufficiency of the post-colonial period that George writes about, and then the resonance that has today. Building on that theme, it's often said that China focuses upon hard development, upon infrastructure, but doesn't, in a sense, do the types of governance activities that you just described. Chris, I wonder if you could say a bit about China's political engagement in terms of how it's adjusted its development role to take account for those different political conditions that Zainab has described, and also that question of state building and compensating for state weakness as a barrier to China expanding its interests and succeeding in the continent.
Great. As we know, it's been a general principle of China's engagement. Indeed, it's been something that's a force of attraction for African states and other states, that they will not interfere with the politics of the day in a given country. It's a sensible approach. It allowed them to distinguish themselves from the other operators in Africa, the Western governments whose involvement was predicated on some form of interference or at least interventionist policies, be they economic or on the extreme end military. So operating in Africa has been a learning curve, and it's to the credit of the Chinese government that they've been able to recognize that these sorts of policies need modification in order to function and perform well. Partnerships require both sides to be functioning, capable, institutionally so. And as a consequence, China, perhaps against its better judgment, has come to the view that it needs to be involved. So non-interference remains a principle, but non-intervention is no longer as such. There's been a conscious engagement with in institution building, capacity building. I already mentioned those models, but it goes further than that. There are a model of management of the development state, right? The idea of a Chinese development, of an Asian or a development state more generally, and China's particular understanding of that and experience of that has informed how China has engaged with, for instance, the political leadership in training ministers, training in African governments, providing training provisions on how to manage state-owned enterprises, how to do the business of development better than had been in the past. So that kind of engagement is reflected in the changing approaches. That deeper engagement is reflected in the changing approaches that China has towards the continent. If you look at from 2012 onward, even the issue of security, right? If we talk about the problems of the African state or some African states, which have different institutional depth or instability or a variety of challenges of that nature, China's right at the heart of some of them. Your own work on Sudan will emphasize that. In some senses, the exposure of China in Sudan brought forward the most obvious examples of the shortcomings of the current approach. They had to be involved in mediation. They had to engage with the international community. By 2012, in the aftermath of the what used to be called the Arab Spring, The Chinese government, and with the evacuation of 30,000 Chinese citizens out of Libya, the concerns about other parts of the continent and indeed the world more generally, there's been a commitment on the part of China to get involved in security. How do you support security? How do you ensure that states are able to maintain that stability, which is crucial? How can this be part of both the win-win proposition that China likes to put forward, so that Chinese economic interests and citizenship interests are secured, but also development remains a feature, or is part of that feature as well. So since 2012, we've seen an active engagement explicit to the African context to support state building activities, capacity building activities in developmental terms, but also in the security sector as well.
So clearly we have a broadening of China's engagement with different related aspects, which goes way beyond what we saw in the 1960s and is compounded by the apparent continuity of Africa's structural subordination in the global economy, questions of dependency as well. So Zainab, could I ask you to tell us what the impact of the recent downturn in the global economy, including China's economy and commodity prices, has been in Africa's various economies, and how that might affect China's engagement?
Okay. So before I launch into that, it's important to realize that this is an ongoing thing, and indeed some of the impacts or their manifestations are, I think we're only starting to get a sense of what is actually happening. And then let's also not forget that when it comes to Chinese engagement in Africa, there's an issue with availability and quality of data. There's just a lot of speculation that flies around, and you have contradictory figures, so it's important to keep that in mind. Having said that, I would say that there are so far about 2 or 3 impacts that we're already observing, or that we can already see. And then there are things that we can speculate about in a sense, or some, maybe to go into a bit of forecasting in terms of like opportunities and threats. So in terms of the impacts that are evident, there's certainly a reduced demand for commodities, especially for commodity exporters in Africa. However, we also have to be very cautious here. There tends to be, this tendency to just say, this is affecting all resource-producing countries. It's not. So there's a difference between Angola, Nigeria, Ghana, Zambia, etc. And this is the fact that Angola exports about 50% of its oil to China. Nigeria exports, I think, less than 10% of its oil to China. Its main trade partner when it comes to oil is India. Same with Ghana. China is not Ghana's main trade partner, even though it has a lot of commodities. So we have to be very careful, and we really have to realize on this issue, Africa is not a country in a sense. So that's one thing. But so there are some figures that sort of, there are some reports that sort of place the figure at about 40% decline of African exports to China within this period because of the economic turmoil, to about 40%. Again, we have to be very cautious. However, even within these resource-rich countries where something is happening, what is interesting is that increasingly China is changing the nature of its engagement in the extractive sector. So whereas it might not be buying a lot of the mineral or resource commodities that it used to buy 2, 3, 4 years ago, what it is doing now is that it is buying mining assets at lower prices and supporting capital investment. So buying bauxite mines in Guinea, iron ore mines in Sierra Leone, and so on and so forth. And then we also have to realize that there are African countries that are not resource rich, so quote unquote, resource poor African countries, Ethiopia, Rwanda, which still have significant relations with China. So that's one thing. The second is that within this context, China is and has been diversifying its business interests in a lot of African countries. So for the past decade or so, it's been moving into services, telecoms, manufacturing. So you look at telecoms firms like Huawei and Techno, which are just expanding across the continent. Huawei has 2 training schools in Nigeria. It's very active in South Africa as well. So the third is that, and this is the interesting thing, there's actually a resurgence of the role of Western bilateral and multilateral partners in Africa, so the IMF, the World Bank, etc., etc. And in a sense, this crisis has made us realize that these other development partners are still very active, in a sense, because maybe over the last few years we've been carried away by the China-Africa dimension of things. So countries that are going through fiscal crisis, from Nigeria to Zambia to Ghana, they're all negotiating either with the IMF for loans or with the World Bank. Nigeria is trying to get about $3.5 billion of loans from the World Bank. Ghana already has a $1 billion loan facility with the IMF. So these multilateral and bilateral partners are still very active. So in terms of the opportunities and threats that I mentioned for us to sort of forecast the immediate future and far future impacts, in a sense, one obvious question that a lot of people have been asking is that with the current downturn in commodity prices and the rebalancing in China, are we going to see a reduction in financial flows from China to Africa? And if this is the case, then what form is it going to take? And is this going to affect the pledge by Xi Jinping on providing $60 billion to Africa that he did in December last year? Will this affect concessional loans and so on and so forth? I think in sort of discussing these threats or how they're going to manifest, it's important to also realize 2 things. So one is financial flows so far, at least from the little data we have that we can rely on, they are not necessarily ceasing or declining, but they are changing. So there's a report by Bloomberg that was published several weeks ago, which notes that we're seeing more loans for infrastructure now replacing foreign direct investment from China. So loans for, a number of projects in Nigeria, the railway projects, the Mombasa to Kigali railway line, and so on and so forth. The second is also we have to understand the sort of psychology or the business strategy of approach of a lot of Chinese decision makers, whether at the level of the government or at the level of the firm, which a lot of studies show, they're a bit more long-term in their approach. They're very profit-driven, but there's a more long-term view. So there are studies on Zambia and also the little field work that I've done in Nigeria, talking to some Chinese entrepreneurs. There's always this sense that despite whatever economic turmoil or despite the tough economic climate, production will continue. They feel invested in the local community, and for them, a strategy would be not to lay off staff. Rather, they would prefer to cut production hours because they feel they are providers of labor, or they feel that they would prefer to view profit in a broader sense as opposed to just focusing on the material benefits. So being strategically invested in that country over the long term. So those are 2 things we have to sort of consider when we're thinking about these threats and how they can manifest in the future. if there is time, I think I want to go over the opportunities that I mentioned.
Certainly.
Okay, so let me quickly go through that. So in this discourse on the impact of declining commodity prices, declining demand from China, I feel strongly that there aren't sufficient discussions on opportunities. And the opportunity here, one at least that I can see, and quite a number of analysts have mentioned as well, is China is rebalancing. It's trying to move from this export-oriented industrial manufacturing powerhouse to a service-oriented economy focusing on financial services, health, technology, and things like that. So the consequence of that is it will offshore lower end of the production processes, and it's already doing this, in the Philippines, in Vietnam, and other parts of Asia. So the discussion now has been, is Africa ready to tap into this opportunity? Is Africa or are African countries going to key into this, in a sense, global value chain? Chris mentioned that for China, its engagement in Africa has very much been informed by its own history, right? The history of its own engagement with other development partners, or its own development trajectory. And one of the things that China did when it was going through that economic transition was that it was really the workshop of a lot of multinational corporations, from Japan to Korea to the United States. So I guess the opportunity for Africa now is, if to an extent it could try to replicate, not transplant directly, but replicate some of that. Can African countries ready and positioning to serve as as venues for some of those lower ends of the production processes as China makes that economic transition? Is there infrastructure ready? Are talks and action on regional integration proceeding as planned? East Africa is making tremendous progress in that regard with the One Network agreement on telecommunications, the transport infrastructure and things like that. So those are some of the opportunities and the threats and the immediate impacts that we can see and that we're witnessing.